All right, in this session we're going to talk about the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Numbers obviously has a title to it that is reflective of a couple of very significant events in the book itself. In its largest sweep, the book of Numbers tells various stories of what happens to the Israelites on their journey, basically between Mount Sinai, where God has appeared to them and has revealed himself to them and has given them the law or the 10 words. Between that great event and the people being ready and poised to go into Canaan. So there are a variety of things, happenings, and stories that happen along the way. And the book of Numbers is a real twist and turn of what kinds of stories develop in the wilderness. So we'll come to that in just a moment. At the beginning of the book, there is a military census. In other words, all of the men who are military age, 20 and above, are counted. And then a census is taken again at the end of the book. The significance of the census is that in the first census, we are counting the number of eligible men who are coming out of Egypt. In the second census, however, because of the stories in the in-between space, stories of rebellion and stories of disobedience, the original generation or the generation that has come out of Egypt will not be the same generation that will go into Canaan. The second census at the end of the book is a census that now goes and counts the second generation. So these will again be men who are 20 years and older, who can participate in military engagement, but it will be the generation that follows the generation that has come out of Egypt. So the numbering at the beginning of the book and the numbering at the end of the book are numberings of two different generations. And obviously, as you can see, it will be quite significant to be able to tell the stories of what happens in the in-between space. So, as I alluded to just a few moments ago, the stories in between the two countings or in between the two census, the stories reflect on the one hand, a number of instances in which Israel rebels. They are in the wilderness. And the wilderness, by the way, in the Bible is not just a geographical place. It is a spiritual place. It is a theological place. So keep in mind as you are reading the stories of what happens to Israel and their moments of rebellion or their grumbling or their complaining, whatever it might be, keep in mind that these are not just stories that reveal the historical happenings and displays of a particular people. These are stories which do more than that. These are stories which reveal the heart and soul of a people. These are stories which, even on a grander scale than even that, speak to the spiritual condition, and they are stories that are filled with theological insight on the relationship of people with God and people with each other. So while Israel is in the wilderness, God's primary intent, getting them out of Egypt and getting them into the wilderness, his primary interest is in making a people that is his own. And rather than just rushing them out of Egypt and into a promised land, it is going to take some time for the revelation of God to kind of settle in among the people, and for God himself to settle in among the people, in the sense that he is a God who wants to live amidst the people. And the same issue that we have seen with the end of Exodus and the book of Leviticus as primarily a centerpiece of worship is now the issue that Israel faces as they are moving about the wilderness. And that issue is, how does God, who is holy, find a place to live or dwell among a people who are rebellious and who are stubborn and who are unholy? How is all of that going to happen, and how will all of that relational stuff kind of display and reveal itself? So in the book of Numbers, we have some moments that look fairly desperate for Israel, moments in which as God is seeking to make a people out of them, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, a people through whom he can bear witness to the rest of the world. Of all things, these people at times just want to go back home. They want to go back to a home in Egypt, which they consider to be home. They want to go back to the routines and the rigors of slavery. They want to go back to the old menus that they were accustomed to. They want to go back to the lifestyle that they had as a subjected people. And so, in a sense, although they have been given the great redemptive moment of the Red Sea, there is yet a redemption that needs to happen within them. There is a redemption that needs to happen within their hearts, within their relationship with God, within their community. And so this book is a journey not only on a map, but it is a journey throughout the heart of Israel, or throughout even the human heart. It is a theological statement or a theological reflection of what this journey looks like and the impact of the wilderness and what life in the wilderness looks like. So it is an amazing journey of people on a number of different levels. And the opposition and the resistance that emerges in these stories can come from just about any source, as I've just alluded to moments ago. Some of the resistance itself comes from within the people. Some of the resistance comes from the circumstances in which they find themselves, the lack of the kind of food that they would enjoy, the particular terrain of the wilderness. And so some of the resistance comes about just by where they are. Some of the resistance is aimed back at Moses for leading them from Egypt and leading them out into this place. Some of the resistance even comes from Moses' family. Some of the resistance will come from the religious leaders at a time. Some of the resistance will come from outlying enemies. And so you can see that there are a number of ways in which Israel, in this process of being formed and fashioned into the people of God, there are just a number of ways in which this process can be frustrated. And in some sense, for this original and first generation out of Egypt, in which this process just has to be transferred over to another generation. So as the stories unfold and as you see the different places from which the resistance or the rebellion will come, the big issue in all of this to keep in mind is that regardless of how the people respond under pressure or in a particular set of circumstances, God's promise that He issued all the way back to Abraham is still the covenant promise that God is going to keep. It is still the covenant promise that God is going to honor and that God is going to fulfill. So while Israel is doing just about everything imaginable that it can to disgust and frustrate the story of being a people of God, God is constantly honoring the promise that He has made to Abraham. Now, that doesn't certainly mean that God gives a pass, for there are moments in which there's great judgment and reaction from God. And that judgment, in the big picture of things, and in the response of God at times to Israel's rebellion, is in fact a response that continues to honor and keep the covenant promises ongoing. So there is, as always in biblical stories that are reflective of God's people, there are times in which we see great measures of judgment as a God response to what is happening. And we also see moments in which there are great measures of grace and beautiful moments in which we see that by God's grace people are made whole, or people experience redemption, or there is an act of forgiveness, or the relationship with God that in some way had been frustrated, disrupted, is now a relationship that is being healed, or a relationship in which wholeness is coming back into the relationship. So the book of Numbers is a very interesting narrative. It is a narrative that it comes out of all that has preceded it, a storyline that certainly goes back to Abraham with the promises of God on the table, and it is a story in which there's almost kind of a struggle that exists between God creating a people and the people responding to what God is creating in them, and that God is making for Himself a people, and yet the people in many cases seem to be resistant. I didn't mention a moment ago, very interesting, that there is even a story in which the resistance comes from a paid prophet, a paid pagan prophet, who is hired to come in and to announce curses on the people of Israel. And very interestingly, in this story, we have things like talking donkeys. We have a guy who's receiving some sum of money from a king to come in and just land curses upon the people of God. And yet, God's faithfulness to His covenant, even through this kind of bizarre situation, God is so faithful to His covenant that even when the prophet for hire, the pagan prophet for hire, comes in and he seeks to pronounce cursings upon God's people, when he finally is able to speak, and when he utters, all he can do is announce and proclaim a blessing upon God's people. So we see places where God is so working, even if He is working oftentimes in Numbers against the resistance of his own people, God is faithful to his covenant. God is both judgmental and merciful. And we also see in these stories where even the likes of Moses himself, after all he has done, after how he has led the people so admirably, after being the guy who just reflects the glory of God and speaks to God, even Moses gets caught up in a moment where he is frustrated by the whole story, and he approaches a rock with his staff and strikes the rock. Water comes out of the rock. It is God who provides the water, but the heart of the story is that in those brief moments, or in that encounter, in that particular situation, Moses, in a sense, usurped the place of God in that story. And although God did provide, and there we see God's grace and provision, there is also this judgment. And as a consequence of that, Moses himself is not able to set foot into the promised land. So we have in the book of Numbers God creating a people who oftentimes are resentful or resisting to what God is doing. And as a result of God's judgment, we see that an entire generation, or the original generation, is going to not make it to the promised land. And all of that has just come about because essentially they have sent spies into the promised land, and when the report came back, only two of those, Joshua and Caleb, exercised any sense of faith that the giants that they saw in the land could be defeated by God. And the people got all feverish about this report of the spies, and their hearts were leaned toward the majority report, in which we just cannot go into a land, we're going to get wiped out by the giants. And so the new generation is here, and the first counting, the original census, now becomes, as we think about it theologically, now becomes something of a place where we can see that the people are going to be resistful, and the curse of God will ultimately fall, in the sense that they will die in the wilderness. Then we see the second census. A whole new generation has come, and this generation is the generation that will ultimately go into Canaan and will take the promised land. And we see something of the blessing of God. So as you're reading through the book of Numbers, keep in mind that we have a lot of stories, and a lot of the tension in those stories rests upon the reality that God is on mission. And these stories are rooted all the way back to promises God has offered to Abraham. And even though people have been redeemed in the most dramatic way through the Red Sea, there's still the tension and still the sense of rebellion that people do not want to be made by God to be his people while they are in the wilderness. So the book of Numbers comes to an end, and as we come to the book of Deuteronomy, we basically have Moses speaking to the generation that will go into the promised land. So reading the book of Deuteronomy, you'll encounter a number of speeches. They might be sound like sermon or contemporary type sermon to many of us, But basically, we have Moses speaking to the generation that is going to be pressing forward. It's always really interesting when somebody like a Moses has come to the end of their life to see what stories they choose to reflect upon. And we have a lot of this in the book of Deuteronomy. What will be the stories that Moses pulls out? What will be the stories that he frames up for the new generation? What will be the stories that come right from his lips as words of instruction, as words of memory, as words of encouragement? And so as you are reading the book of Deuteronomy, keep in mind that this is the way Moses is the interpreter of the story. This is the way that Moses is going to pass on all that has happened beforehand. These are the stories that he will tell. This is the way that he will tell those stories. This is how Moses will interpret those stories. This is the perspective of Moses as he has lived through those stories himself. So Moses is gathered before the new generation, and at the heart, at the centerpiece of the book itself, there'll be laws and stipulations, and although to us these words sound very legalistic, or they engender in us something of a sense of this is going to be legalistic, keep in mind that just as God's revelation to Moses at Mount Sinai through the Ten Commandments or through the 10 words were words of freedom, were words of liberty, were words of how do we have relationship, so is it with these words of Deuteronomy. Moses will even recount the 10 words or the 10 commandments, and then he'll draw out of that, and he will unpack those words in relational terms. And so please don't take the posture that is tempting for us to take, that many people take, that this is just more legal kind of stuff or legalese for their day. This is really words of life, how to live in a healthy relationship, how to keep in mind that God is honoring the promise that was made to Abraham, that God is fashioning a people, that this people will go into the land of Canaan, and that God will be their leader, and he will triumph, and there is going to be a transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua. And the book of Deuteronomy becomes a great way to listen. The word, we often use the word Torah, instruction, or listening and obeying. These words of Moses are Torah. They are instructions that are not just instructions for the mind or for the law. These are instructions. These are ways of life that are rooted in stories. They are ways of life that are rooted in the covenant promise of God. They are ways of life that are anchored in what God is making out of his people, and what God desires and designs for his people. So Moses speaking to this generation is a way for us to hear along with that new generation what the stories are, how Moses recounts those stories, and how Moses relays and interprets the stories to a new generation as they are refreshed and as they hear again the stories of those who have gone before them. And they are reminded again that this is all about a covenant that God has made, and he is making a people, and through that people he will reveal himself to the world. Amidst all of that, there is in the book of Deuteronomy, which, by the way, it might be surprising to a number of us how significant the book of Deuteronomy is in the New Testament and in many parts of the Old Testament, where it is referred back to, or there is an echo or reflection back to this particular book. There's a passage in the book of Deuteronomy which is called the Shema, the hearing. And this, of all of the things in Deuteronomy, kind of serves as an interpretive lens for the entire book and even beyond. And because of its significance, I will just read the passage. And as you hear this passage, listen along, because you will also undoubtedly hear the words of Jesus through this. But the Shema is a passage that comes from Deuteronomy 6 and beginning at verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. These commandments that I give to you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. These are the words from God that serve as an ever reminder that in this covenant making process, or a covenant keeping process, the making of a nation, the making of Israel, that God is one. There will always be sufficient temptation to think that there is this one God, Yahweh, and perhaps there are other gods, or perhaps there are gods that are in cooperation with Yahweh. But at the very heart and central moment of this faith and of this word and of this covenant is that there is only one God, and He is Yahweh. And then as a corollary to that is that we are to love God with everything that is within us, and then to love each other, to love one another. And so you can see in these words how compact, how rich, how directive, how much these words make their way time and time and time and again throughout the rest of the story of what God does. And essentially these very words end up on the lips of Jesus himself. So I hope that you will enjoy the experiences that you have as you are reading the book of Numbers, and as you see people who are in the process of being made as a covenant people, and we will see a lot of ourselves in those stories, and yet we will also see that the covenant of God triumphs through any kind of opposition, rebellion that might emerge in its way. And then we ultimately see how Moses takes those stories, interprets them, shares them with the new generation. And when Moses is done telling the story in a beautiful scene at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, he goes up a mountain. His eyes, at the age of 120, his eyes look over the land which his feet will never be set. And God himself buries Moses. So it becomes a very moving and very unique picture of Moses' significance, of his impact, of his life, and of his legacy. So have a wonderful time as you walk through the wilderness or walk into the wilderness, and as you open your own heart and soul and see what is happening there, and as you begin to think theologically about these stories and hear again the words of Moses, of the Shema, to love that there's one God and that we are to love him with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love each other as well.